Now, I do want to say I wrote the title of this talk before I knew that I was going to be speaking right after Jen, who was really talking about the future of web design, but this actually fits pretty nicely. And we also have a lot of feelings in common about graphic design and its place on the web, whether it's been there or not, and how much we might like it to be a part of the conversation. So, my name's Jason. I work at a company called Isovera, just outside Boston. I I basically run the design and development team there, and generally tinker with a lot of things, typography being a main area of focus. In truth, most people really just know me because of them. I post lots of photos. It's Tristan on the left, and Tilly, we just adopted a few months ago, is actually a cousin of Tristan's, is there on the right. They're way more famous than I am. Most of the time when I go to conferences, that's what people ask me about, is like, how's Tristan and how's Turner Reservoir in the morning? So that's where we go walk. And I thought it might be kind of nice to actually take a moment, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of typographic terms, to explain a little bit about those typographic terms and what the implications are for what I'm going to talk about with variable fonts. And I thought they might be able to help me out with some of these terms. So we have width. We're also going to talk about weight, X height, and slant. So it's a little primer and some typographic terms. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of typography quickly, because this is a much shorter time slot than I was expecting. Most of the web is words. The problem is the care with which we have set those words on the web has been somewhat lacking at times. So if we go back in time and we look at things like this manuscript, that art and science of typography and how we present written communication has been evolving and advancing for centuries. I mean, look at this from late 1400s. This is a typeface designed by Jansen that's actually echoed through the ages and still used today. This is a spread from Robert Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style, really beautifully presented and thoughtfully laid out using lots of those design and proportion principles that Jen talked about, and a lot of nuance in how the type itself is used. This is one of my current favorites, Keith Houston's book, The Book, about the book. But it's really beautifully done. I mean, the book itself is almost like a living infographic as you go through understanding the terminology and the way things have been laid out. And all of those things are really beautifully done. But the question is, how do we bring all of this to the web? So it's a story about some dragons. The first dragon that we have to deal with is the practice of typography itself in digital medium. It's different. There are things about it that are fundamentally altered from the way we practice typography in print. So how can't we control these things? So there's a lot of things that we can do in print. We can be very explicit about how we lay things out, and things tend to stay where we put them, which is kind of nice, except on the web, we don't have any certainty, really. We don't know what typeface it will be rendered in. We can specify it, and we can hope that it will be in a particular typeface, but we can't really control that. Oftentimes, we can't control the content itself because it's in a content management system, so we don't know how many words they're going to be or how many characters. We also might not know the circumstances in which it's viewed. So I worked very hard to recreate this early browser scene that Jen so eloquently put up on screen with an actual screenshot. But this is what the web looked like when I started. And we couldn't really do much of anything at all other than insert some line breaks and make things a little bit bigger. And over time, things improved, and we were able to set a width on things, and then we got Arial. It mixed on that. But then we flashed forward a few more years, and we got to the ability to embed real typefaces. So we have Open Sans, which is kind of like the new Arial, but slightly nicer. And there's lots of different weights of that. And then things came forward a little bit more, and open type features for the web came around, so we were able to actually get much nicer punctuation, get ligatures and all the better kerning, all of these things. So on the web, we were able to increase our dynamic range by having all of these different weights and variants. We could embed real typefaces. We could get better typographic nuance through the support of open type features. That's kind of amazing. So we've been able to almost catch up to what we've been able to do in print for a few centuries. Pretty awesome. We're really making some progress. So we could consider, perhaps, that we've dealt with that first dragon. However, that brings us to the second one, where we run headlong into performance. So the problem with what we had in that previous scene was we get this tremendous range at a very high cost. There's over 500K worth of fonts that were being downloaded alone just in that one page. And that's not sustainable, because what happens is if it takes that long to show up, people don't actually wait around to see the content. So this is the reality that we have. That's a real thing. Browsers will have a timeout, and Safari on iOS for a very long time didn't have a timeout. So when that content doesn't get rendered because you're waiting for all these web fonts to load on a slow network connection, you could be waiting around all day to see anything show up on the screen at all. So that's two very diametrically opposed things. So rather than this, we pull back. So we had this wonderful voice that we've had to curtail, and we get this. Now, some people might look at that and think, okay, that's all right. We're getting the point across. The point is the content. That's the driving force. I get that. But what about voice? What about distinction? What about emphasis and hierarchy? We've lost a little bit of that tonal range. Less than a year ago, we had something pretty significant happen. And at this event, there were 5 companies, most of which you've heard of, Adobe, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, all got up and talked about this evolution of the open type specification that came about through this kind of collaboration to try and see what could they do to bring all of these different aspects or variations of a typeface into a single file. So if you've had to implement web fonts before, you know that for every single weight and variant that you might want to use, that's a different file that has to be loaded. And I'm ignoring the fact that it's 4 versions of every one of those files, but you take the point. It's complicated. If you want bold, italic, and regular, there's 4 different files you've got to manage. This is bringing it all into one. So we have this really interesting possibility of a single file that can satisfy both our vocal range that we would like to have in our design, as well as having a single asset to download instead of all of these different assets. So flashing back to that previous example, I had 18 different font files that were being loaded to show that one page. Now we could do it with 1. It's not as small as a single font file that's a single weight, but it's certainly not as big as 6 or 8 or 10 or 20. So if you really want to have this broad range to do things like this, you can have that one file that has all of these different weights. So this is from Nick Sherman's talk on variation fonts a while ago. And here's an animation of that in action that I took from the Axis Praxis site. I'll talk about that in a little while. So this is a variation font in the browser being dynamically resized with CSS. One file, all being done in real time. That's kind of interesting. I was waiting if that had actually shown up. So if type is the voice of our words, that voice just became a chorus. That's pretty interesting. So as designers, we can get this wonderful range. We can do all of these things from very, very small to very, very large, from very skinny to very wide, super heavy to super light. That gives us a lot to work with as designers. So if you think about coupling that with all these ideas about layout, like that last one, I think it was a real estate company with the balloon, that kind of variation is something that you could very easily do and actually do to even greater effect. But as I know that many of you are fans of Game of Thrones, you can never forget the third dragon. That's disaster. So what is it about this? What is the third thing that this variation font solves? That's something that, the more I played with it, that's where it really started to hit home for me. When you look at things on a small screen, one of the problems that we have is that line length gets really short and choppy. So we have to start to do some things to try and cheat that a little bit to create readable, enjoyable, usable content. Well, the designers of these typefaces very often actually do design narrower weights. We just don't want to load them because on the larger screen we might want to have a little bit more robust, more open feel. But to achieve good readable content on a small screen, it would be kind of nice if we could take advantage of some of the design aspects that are offered, react with CSS, and on that smaller screen, subtly narrow that typeface and subtly increase the optical size. So the counters and bowls are a little bit bigger, but the overall typeface is just slightly narrower. And we could get easily 10% more characters per line and create a little bit better reading experience on that small device. So we've increased our tonal range, we've increased our performance, and now we've opened up the ability to create much more readable and enjoyable content by being able to tweak the actual optics of those characters themselves based on the size of the viewport. Okay. So we've solved the problem of our dragons. So now they're back to being like tiny models on a table. So that was good. We got through that pretty quickly. That opened up some pretty interesting things. What about the future business? What does that do for us as designers? How do we make use of that? So think back to some of the things that Jen was showing you about layout. And we start to flip through the main pages of all of these major news sites. And I'm guessing that with very few exception, you can't identify a single one of them. But these are the best known publications for news online in the world. We have worked with these systems to optimize for any content anywhere at the cost of our soul of this design. So if we have a system that's optimized for any length headline, any language, these boxes never break, everything always scales, that's great. But what about this content, this time, on this device? So what's that next step? We've gotten past the being able to publish everything, because it is hard. So how many people in here actually code websites? Okay, so it's a whole bunch of people that do that. And I think we can all attest to the fact that it's not easy, but at least things have advanced to the point where we can actually pretty reliably make a pretty responsive site that works really well across a whole range of devices. That's taken us many, many years to get to the point where we can reliably do that. Now that we can, we automate these things as much as we can. We repeat our starting points so that the next project isn't quite so burdensome. But when we've stopped, I mean, really, if you look at the earliest responsive design from the Boston Globe site that Ethan Marcotte was involved in and wrote about, and you look at today's responsive sites, there's really no difference. They all still look exactly the same. It's a whole bunch of squishy boxes that reflow. We haven't really advanced past that. Well, I got to tell you, these monks did not settle for good enough. Why are we? So if we've solved some of this really, really hard stuff, why don't we think about how we can use typography to get beyond that? Because I don't think there is any universal system. Typography is design. It is about communication. It is intentional. I actually don't really love any of these systems that I've seen that have these calculations and viewport units and all these other things to automatically size all of your typography. It's useful in certain cases, but I think there are very intentional relationships between this header and this body copy and that aside, that when everything is scaling according to a formula, you can lose that nuance, and you can lose the ability to emphasize things a little bit differently. So again, now we're going to look back at a bunch of different print newspapers from the last few years, and you can see the range of typographic styles and hierarchy they have are really pretty astonishing. So all of those news websites that I showed you that looked exactly the same, when you look at any of these papers, you can see that there's a whole range of typography that they use to help you understand which story has more prominence than another, which is the really special news and which is the more run-of-the-mill secondary level content. Well, there's something that's in common here. They have graphic designers that work on their layout. That's pretty interesting. So what did we do on the web to get around this? Because we knew we had a system of content that's constantly changing. What we did was we moved things around a little bit. So we had the design first, and then we started thinking about content. And that is a little problematic because, again, it leads us to we need one design system that can house all the content. So this was the workflow, and I think this is the workflow in almost any project and company right now. You have somebody design a system, then you've got somebody writing content, and you've got somebody publishing that content. And it all comes out looking pretty much the same. Well, what if we could go back to that point where, or maybe go forward to the point where we bring the designer back in? So we're working in a content management system that has the ability to structure content. Why can't that also, there we go, bring in the ability to alter the design? So all of these things, now again, think back, we've got one font asset that is changeable with CSS. We have content management systems that have lots of tools in them for altering layout that can be built and altering the content itself. Why not add a few more controls so that we could then influence the typography and start to pull in some of these layout ideas? Content management systems can do an awful lot more than we're currently using them for. So there have been attempts at bringing that level of art direction to the web. So this is from Jason Santamaria's blog. And for a while, he was going through just trying to really art direct every individual blog post. And that was all done very laboriously and all very much by hand. So it really didn't prove sustainable. ProPublica has done some absolutely beautiful work, but the way they achieve interesting, compelling layouts like this is by hitting a big old reset switch on their CMS. So when they go to do a story like this, they actually have to write all the CSS and JavaScript and HTML, and then go publish the story, hit the reset button, and they get a big box to dump everything in. And it blows away all of the styles from the CMS and replaces it with what's been entered for that page. Again, this is not sustainable. I think that we could really do a lot better. And thankfully, I've managed to go through this and probably miss a bunch of notes that I wanted to tell you very quickly so that we can get to the fun part, which is actually show you something that works in the browser. So I mentioned that variable fonts were first introduced in September. So you might be thinking, that's neat, but what could I do now? The nice thing is that at the very least with the nightly builds, you could use variable fonts in every single shipping browser, with the exception of IE11 and Opera Mini. Pretty much everything else, you can play around with it and try it out. That's pretty fascinating that it happened this quickly, and that shows you the commitment of the type industry and all the software vendors in making this happen. And to look at that timeline a little bit, I came home from that conference where it was introduced and was fortunate enough to have a little connection with somebody who was working on implementing this on WebKit. And in less than 3 weeks, we had a nightly build with it supported in Safari. So I was able to actually show this in action in a browser. Apple just released it fully last week. In Safari 11, the next upcoming major version of Apple's browser, they will have full support for variable fonts. Chrome already has it in both Mac and Windows versions. It's behind an experimental web flag in the browser, but it's shipping and it works on both platforms. And both Apple and Microsoft have committed to shipping it fully baked into the operating system by sometime next year. We'll be able to use it in fully released browsers long before. And there are a number of type vendors that are already offering, if you buy the full family of typeface X, we will give you the variable font. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can already play with. You can already buy it, ship it, use it. It's able to be detected for with the feature detects that Jen mentioned in CSS. So it's safe for you to put it in your CSS if it's supported. Otherwise, it will load the standard web fonts. So you actually don't really have to choose between these things. You can start to play around with an experiment now. So I think that would be the better thing to do, is actually show it to you in a browser with some content management tools, and we can actually see it work in action. Now, I have a fairly crude implementation of the UI there. I wanted to show this to you first. This is just something I've been playing around with and just sort of sketching. So if you can imagine, we've got this sample of din next over here on the right with a bunch of different widths and weights in there. Envision that if you selected that line of text, you could open it up in a little pop-up like this and maybe click on that button and see something drop down like so. With these fonts, the designer can still basically assign presets, and they're still defining everything that you want you to be able to change. So not every typeface can be every width and every weight. You're not going to get options that will break a typeface or faux bold something. It's only what the typeface designer intended. But you could do some pretty interesting things with just little range sliders, so that you could say, I want to make this a little thinner, a little thicker, and you could start to bring some intent to your typography and convey a little bit more meaning through how you want to lay these things out. So rather than just show you some screenshots, I thought it might be kind of fun to take a look at how this might actually work. So what I've got here is a variation font from David Jonathan Ross, is the serif one here called Gimlet, and then a typeface of his called Output Sans is the body copy. And he was kind enough to let me use these for this demo, and I've put this together with a few different blocks where we're using the variation fonts. And if we go into the edit view, we can take a look and see a little preview of what each of these pieces might look like. And if I wanted to really change something, like if we go down to the bottom, clearly this is the world's best blog post, and I really wanted to emphasize that. But maybe it's a little overblown, so I might want to dial back the weight a little bit, and maybe it's a smaller world. And we'll just save that and keep it published. Now I'm going to pull it up in another browser where I was using that as well. You can see the world is a lot smaller. And the world is getting a lot smaller because we can share all these things over Twitter. But coming back to the browser again, I mean, that's just one example where we can go ahead and, oops, I don't know what I just clicked on there. Try this again. So I want to edit this, and we'll really kind of crank this out just to really accentuate the difference. And so I've been, played around a little bit with the CSS here. These things are all actually sized with viewport units wrapped around everything else. So with a little bit of finagling, you could actually make this whole block really quite responsive without having to do a whole lot, and have a lot of control. Now again, it's not for everyone. It's maybe not the kind of flexibility you want to give to every single client. But let's not forget that we've had designers involved in publishing content for a very long time. That's a lot of babies and a lot of bathwater, and we've kind of thrown all of this stuff to the side, and we're losing the value of that graphic design knowledge, that history, that understanding of typographic hierarchy and intent, that to amplify this message. And we could create a role when somebody logs into the website where they get these tools. Somebody else enters the content, it's not been published yet, you bring in the designer, and they could actually add a lot of meaning and hierarchy to this without having to necessarily code it. I mean, this is, you know, a few days of making a little demo, but it's kind of cool that this stuff has only been around, only been announced to the world for about 7 or 8 months, and we already have it shipping in browsers. This is something that combine this with the kinds of layout ideas that Jen was showing you just an hour ago, and I think that combination is unbelievably powerful in order to take what we can do so much further. And I'm going to go and just flip back into the presentation again because I had, oh, actually I took it out of there. I mentioned, I turned off my internet connection. That would be why that's not there. I want to turn this on because, and hopefully we won't like break the Wi-Fi, but there's this website, Axis Praxis, axis-praxis.org, was put together by Lawrence Penny. Download the nightly build of, probably the easiest one is to get the nightly build of Safari because you don't have to do anything other than just start it. But there's instructions here on this website to enable it in Firefox, enable it in Chrome, enable it in Opera if you want to. And you can then go to this website and have a play with these things. And this, actually I'm going to stick with the other one because this one requires a wider screen. So if we pick an element here and we can choose from one of the other typefaces. So you can sort of install all of these in the memory of your browser. Now all of a sudden we can play around with a bunch. So CJ Dunbar has a really cool typeface that he designed that allows you to play around with weight and X height. So there's a whole bunch of cool things you can do there. Now the body copy here, interestingly enough, if you have one of the most recent versions of the Mac operating system installed, you've been using a variable font for quite some time. San Francisco is essentially that same technology. They just didn't really want to tell anybody about it. That's why they're so cagey about letting people download it. But we'll just pick one of the other ones that has a little bit more to play with. And so it's not Futura, it's Avenir. It's pretty close. So if we want to get our modernist on, this is actually a pretty good way to do it. Lots of variation between width and weight. So again, think about the possibilities here on small screens to use a slightly narrower version of that typeface to create more readable content. All tied into, well, you could tie it into viewport units. You could tie it into grid. You could tie it into media queries. There's lots of different ways to handle it. But again, you know, you can get that really, really super heavy, chunky stuff alongside that extra light and create this really strong contrast that will create a lot of interest in your layout. So that's axispraxis.org. Have a look at that. It's really a ton of fun. So this is just kind of running through a few different options and places where you can download stuff. Thank you very much.